We are live from our WGSN hub on day 7 of New York Fashion Week. This is our social media newsroom for the Fashion Week season, and behind us you will see shows about to be broadcast. But don't let that distract you. We have our panel here, and we have to my left Simon Collins, Dean of Fashion at Parsons The New School for Design in New York. Welcome.
Thank you.
Aslaug Magnusdottir, I really practiced that one, co-founder and CEO of customizable fashion e-tailer Tinker Tailor, and our very own Aria Hughes, Associate Retail Editor at WGSN. My name's Elle Hankinson. I'm one of the Senior Editors here at WGSN, and I'll be hosting today's panel. So, a little bit of housekeeping. This is an open conversation, and we want to hear your questions and comments. So please contact us, interact with us. Our Q&A app on Google Plus is now activated, or you can use the hashtag WGSN Hangout. So, as you know, the subject of today's conversation is how to make it as an emerging designer. It's a big question, and I think we have some perfect people here to answer it. So just to give you a little bit of context, I'd like you to introduce yourself, tell us about where you come from and where you're now. Actually, we could start with you.
Absolutely. So I've had a slightly unusual career in fashion. I started my career as a lawyer in Iceland, where I grew up, and then came to the States for graduate school. I started working in fashion about 10 years ago, but initially through the investment side. At the time I was living in London and joined an investment company, invested in both small and large brands. And I then moved to New York in 2006 and was lucky enough to meet Marvin Traub in my first week here, and with him did consulting, and we also made some investments in smaller brands, luxury brands. I then got really excited about what was going on online and decided to join the Gilt Group and sometimes say that was my first real fashion job because I was doing merchandising there and not just advising, being an external advisor, and really enjoyed that experience. While I was at Gilt, started thinking about the concept for mode operandi and the need for a new channel to sell products straight off the runway. So I co-founded that back in 2010 and ran that company for about 3 years and left just over a year ago and started working on Tinker Tailor, which is that I now it's all about customization and creation, reaching the customer in that creative process.
Fantastic, and I suppose it's an elevated idea. So it's online, customers can pick and choose components to create their own designs based on existing ones in some cases.
Yeah, so there are two core components to the concept. We work with a number of fashion brands, so far about 80 brands, and what they offer is customizable fashion. So every piece of apparel that goes onto the site has customization options. And so far it's only women's items, but you can do things like add sleeves to a dress, add length, adjust the neckline, change colors, add embellishments, etc. So it's almost like bringing more of an old school couture type of feeling to a very modern online experience.
Wonderful.
And then we also let people create from scratch a Tinker Tailor branded item. That's a little bit more like going to a tailor. If you have a specific idea and want to create a dress, a top, or a skirt, you can use our 3D tool, which is the first of its kind, to kind of render that live, layer different fabrics on.
Wonderful.
And then that we produce for you.
Fantastic. And Aria, a little bit about your background and what you're working on at WGSN. I know there's a lot.
Yeah, so I'm WGSN's Associate Retail Editor. So technically, I'm in charge of covering new stores that open in New York. But I also handle a lot of U.S. retail trends at large and strategy. And then fashion is going on, I go to shows, and I kind of have a vested interest in new and emerging designers just because it's an interesting space for me. So I cover retail along with new brands and strategy and trends and consumer insights, all that.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Simon, you could tell us a little bit about.
Well, you know, Elle, it just struck me that I'm actually a failed emerging designer.
And yet not so failed.
No, I mean, I do believe that failure is fantastic because you learn something from it. But the first thing I did when I left fashion school was fail as an emerging designer, which was a wonderful experience. I learned an awful lot doing it. That was in London. And then I worked around London for a while, and in 1997 moved to New York to become creative director for various companies like Fila. And then in 2005 and 6, I moved to Hong Kong to be creative director of Nike. So I've enjoyed a very nice international life in the fashion world, making every mistake you can possibly think of, but I'm looking forward to making more. But learning from them all, and perhaps that was what gave me the point of view that enabled me to take my current job, which is the Dean of the School of Fashion at Parsons. And what we've done for the last 6 years is we've taken a very respected design school and turned it into this global brand, making friends with all kinds of different people around the world, LVMH and Kering and every other worthwhile company you care to think of. And now I find myself in the very exciting position of having announced I'm going to be leaving, and so I'm looking forward to finding something else, and I was going to say to fail at, but to learn from, starting next year.
Wonderful. Well, let's try not to fail today. Let's start with the conversation. We have a fantastic pedigree, and I am really excited to get going. So the first thing I wanted to approach is the kind of the design process and the manufacturing process. And I think, Simon, you are perfectly poised to answer this. Something I'm really intrigued to know is, let's have a little bit of an insider's insight into life at Parsons. What's the first piece of advice you give to your students on the first day of their course?
You know, the only way anyone's ever going to make it as a designer is if it's the only thing they can possibly do. If you ask anyone that's showing this week or any of the other weeks around the world, there's literally nothing else they could do. They may say they like architecture or whatever else it is, but this is the only thing they can do. And so we say to our students when you arrive, if you could do something else, you probably should. Like, you'll make loads more money as a banker. So if you want to be a banker, then please have fun. But if you can't do anything else because you have this passion within you and this drive and this all-abiding compulsion, then that's okay. We'll give you the tools to express that vision. We can't make you a great designer, but we can give you the tools to then go out and become a great designer. But it has to be in you first.
Fantastic. And you and I have spoken about this idea of the new normal, which is, I think, a kind of 360-degree approach to being a brand and self-marketing. Do you think that now, in this digital age, that it is enough to be purely an aesthetic designer, or must we all be a brand?
I did meet someone this week who reminded me that you can be purely an artist because he had a really, really rich uncle who paid for everything. So if you have one of those, then yes, you can absolutely be a pure designer, because it doesn't matter if anyone buys your stuff because you don't need the money. However, if you don't, you do still have to eat. And that's really what it comes down to. Design, like any other endeavor, it has to pay the bills. And that can be making one-off incredible creations and selling them for... I met someone in China the other day who sells dresses for $500,000. And that's okay. He doesn't make very many of them, but he makes a wonderful living doing that. And so I have nothing but respect. And I've got some great friends who work for Target who make hundreds of thousands of garments. And I respect them equally. So what that tells me is that fashion is an industry. You have to make a living.
Undoubtedly.
Now, to your point about the new normal, I had some students when I first arrived at Parsons, and someone rushed me in to see them and said what they've done. And these three young men had got together, and instead of just designing a collection on paper, they'd done that, but they'd also made half the garments, and they shot them on models, and they'd made a lookbook, and they'd made the woven tags that go in the back, and the hang tags, and then they'd actually made a video, a commercial, and then finally they'd photoshopped their image into Times Square onto one of the billboards. And they were like, well, why wouldn't we? Like, that's our vision. And the thing is, that's the new normal. Of course, we've all got phones that can do everything now. So if you are any kind of creative person and you're not maximizing all these different avenues all the time, everywhere, then I wonder whether you're really going to be a competitor.
So actually, perhaps we're saying this is relative commerciality. You have to be commercial, but you can access different points of that scale.
But I always worry about that word commercial because it's always used disparagingly. And what I love about this great city, New York, and I've lived in others around the world, which are wonderful too, but what I love about here is it's okay. It's okay to be successful and make loads of money. You know, we really don't mind that. And commercial is not a disparaging word. You know, name me the finest designer. John Galliano, I think, arguably one of the finest designers of our lifetime. He was very successful. He made lots and lots of money for Dior and his own brand and all the other things. So is that commercial? But I mean, you'd never say John Galliano was a commercial designer. So someone needs to explain that to me because I'm rather dense and I don't understand why it's a bad thing.
Absolutely. I think certainly many of the conversations we've had is about bringing the two together, and often they're seen as being two unique ideas.
What they are is this.
Yeah.
You can't distance them. Like I said, unless you've got a rich uncle, you have to make a living. You've got to sell whatever it is. So, you know, you can't separate them.
Which actually kind of leads into the point I was making just before we went on air, which was I'd structured these questions into these ideas of design, manufacturing and investment, and then into retail. But actually, I think what we're speaking about already is that to be a designer, to be a brand, it's about all of these things. This is the 360 approach. And exactly as you say, this kind of make-do mentality, which, not make-do, that's not the right term, sorry, but making it happen mentality. People are just doing it. And I think that's really exciting. In terms of marketing, you know, Aslaug, you've been in so many different parts of the industry, being a retailer, being an investor, being a consultant. I'm really intrigued to know, you brought the trunk show to the mainstream at Moda Operandi. Can you just explain a little bit about this?
Yes, absolutely. So you know, during my time at Guild, I kept hearing, and this was in 2009 to 10, the economy, you know, was rough, and I kept hearing complaints from designers that they would create these beautiful collections, but that the stores were scared to buy the statement pieces, the most, you know, the pieces that they often felt most strongly about from a design and aesthetic standpoint. And that the situation was getting worse because of the situation within the economy. And at the same time, I experienced as a consumer and spoke to a lot of my friends who loved to shop fashion that wanted those special pieces and you know, would see them maybe on the runway or see them on Vogue.com the day of the show, and then were disappointed to find out they could never buy them. So there seemed like a big disconnect there. And the idea behind Moda was give a little bit more power to the end consumer. Let the designer, you know, Moda put the full collection and puts onto the site often within hours of the show or within days of a show, and then lets the end consumer place orders from that trunk show. So it's still within the time frame that the designer has their books open, and customers are then able to place orders on any piece from the runway. And this gives designers the added benefit of really knowing what the end consumer is reacting to, not just what that department store buyer is reacting to.
So rather than changing the retail chain, which is what we've talked about in previous Hangouts, this is actually more about changing the powers, perhaps, and giving more power to the consumer. I wonder, with this in mind, do you think that those steps have perhaps reduced the importance of fashion shows today?
I don't think they have, actually. One of the things that I thought about a lot when starting Moda is that designers were spending all of this money on fashion shows, but there was no direct commercial opportunity. And what Moda created was an opportunity for designers to monetize the show, and really put those pieces, all of those pieces, in front of the customer within days of the show, and see what the customer was reacting to. And it really, that model thrives on the excitement that is generated by the runway show. So I really think it strengthens the runway rather than decreases the need for it.
So we still think there's that importance there. Aria, I know that you have attended a lot of shows this week and many weeks previously.
I mean, I think for a young designer, I don't think there should be a rush to put on a show if you're not ready for younger designers. There's been a lot of brands that have been quite successful without showing. Does it help to be on the schedule? Definitely. I mean, that's how I discover a lot of new designers. If I see an unrecognizable name, I Google it and look into them and, figure out, what they're doing and, if I like them or not. But I don't think it's completely necessary. There's a brand called C who I don't think they've shown at Fashion Week, and they've been quite successful. And they've kind of focused first on product and buyers and making money before publicity and press. So I think that's something that younger designers should consider as well.
I agree with that. Setting up a runway show is extremely expensive. And I would say with my new business now, Tinker Tailor, that is not dependent on fashion seasons. There we put designer collections on the site throughout the year. They're exclusive collections that are all customizable. And, we don't really care whether those have been featured on the runway or not. So I do think there is, in terms of these seasons, because people are getting that immediate access to the information, they're seeing everything so quickly, it doesn't make a lot of sense that they have to wait so long for the items after that, because in the meanwhile, they've, been copied in various forms and often people have forgotten about them 6 months later when they finally arrive in store. So I think that's the more important change that needs to happen to the industry is, not whether a show is relevant or not, but that lead time between the show and getting the collection out needs to be shorter.
I think it's important to not overestimate the power of a runway show as well. I mean, certainly there are some which are magical and you want to be there and it's a really special moment and that's what Fashion Week is for, which is wonderful. But I've lost count of the number of times that students come to us and their dream is to have a runway show. And after about 3.8 seconds, they realize that the runway show is wonderful for the moment that it happens and then work starts again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And work is the other 50 weeks of the year that are not the 2 fashion weeks. And so what I'm excited by is the evolution of the fashion weeks. The fact that we have opening ceremony doing a play and we have people doing live presentations, and the fact that there are many designers that are successful without showing during New York Fashion Week or the other fashion weeks, which again, it doesn't diminish the importance for some of that. I just think has expanded the whole world of it, which I'm very excited by.
And actually, I think that this kind of what we're essentially talking about is how you market yourself, the different approaches, the different ways of approaching your platform, what that platform is. And I think that this leads into my next question, which is, if you could tell me your opinions on best ways to market yourself as an emerging designer. I know there are so many social platforms now, so many opportunities, and other than showing, what are the ways to kind of get yourself seen and heard and known?
To me, it's exactly the same as it always was. There's just more tools to do it with. I don't think that a runway show is it. And I've lost, you see these runway shows and you think, oh, the poor love, because they spend all this money and no one goes. No one of any relevance. It's one of their mates. Like, what's the point of that? So, but you don't need a runway show because, what's it about? It's about making clothes and selling them to people. So how do you achieve that? And it used to be you had to appeal to an editor who would feature your stuff, and then a buyer would look at it, and then maybe you had a runway show, and then finally it would be in the store and you would sell. And that was the only way to do it. Not anymore. Now you don't need any of those people. Has
changed entirely.
You don't need any of those. You can shoot everything on your iPhone. You can manufacture it locally, or you can go to one of these wonderful startup companies that will manufacture for you. You've got new sites like yours, which will showcase it. That, there are a myriad other places. You can do all of it without using any of the conventional system, which I think is wildly exciting. And I say that, though, with full respect for the conventional system, because there are some, you look at the great stores in this city, and they're really extraordinary, and they're wonderful. But I think they've shifted from being just the only place you could go to being this sort of marketing statement as much as anything else. How many stores now rely for a huge chunk on their own online sales, which is new. So the great thing is that we don't know, and it's up to these 20-somethings to figure it out and to confound our expectation, to prove us wrong. That's what I love the fact that I failed when I first left school. I failed all the way through, but I love it when young people come to me and say, no, you're wrong. Because I like a fight, and I like to be wrong, because then I can go and say to you lot, no, you're wrong.
Obviously, he's not
Well,
actually
obviously,
saying
I
that.
would never say that. Yeah. Well, you never would be.
So I'm intrigued. Are we perhaps saying, I'm being provocative here, but is marketing overtaking design? Is the new power?
Oh.
I don't think marketing
Yeah.
is overtaking design. Both are extremely important, but I think it's harder
To be a successful designer today without having the ability to navigate marketing your creativity that you have as a designer, you have to apply to your marketing skills, because being creative in terms of marketing is what's really going to make people notice you, in addition to your beautiful design. The product always has to be there. It can't be just about marketing. But I do agree with everything Simon said. Sorry, there's no debate here.
This is meant to be a debate.
But I would say that, these new platforms have, in many ways, in some ways it's harder to get noticed, but it's also, you can go out there and put yourself in front of the world at a much lower cost and with lower risk than you ever could before.
Yeah.
For example, by working with websites that have a global audience and that don't necessarily require you to produce anything up front, but are taking orders. But both Moda and Tinker Tailor function in that way and are therefore very emerging designer friendly, good for designers that don't have a lot of capital. And both sites take orders from customers up front and then pass on a deposit to the brand before they have to produce. So they have the money to fund the production of their collection. So that's just one example of new ways that have helped emerging designers in terms of their marketing.
I think it is the new normal, because I've been talking a lot around the world lately about design thinking, and that really means thinking about every single element of what you're doing, whether it's the marketing or whether it's the brochure you send, or whether it's your strategy for who you send it to, or whether even further back it's the homework you do about what kind of business you want. All of that has to be considered all the way through, and I feel very strongly that you can only be successful in any of those areas, even in the legal side of what you do, if you think like a designer. And that doesn't mean a fashion designer has to be running the entire company, although you've got someone like Jason Wu that is, who's quite brilliant at it. But it does mean that everyone, in whatever discipline they're in, has got to start thinking like a designer. Because when you look at the most incredibly successful companies, like the one that yesterday that announced that new gizmo,
you might have heard of them.
But in any conversation, you've got to try and have it without mentioning that word. But everything they do is considered, like even the inside of the packaging. It's like
Absolutely.
Every single thing you do, the interaction in the store and where the stores are, all those things. And so to be successful in any part of this glorious industry that is the fashion industry, everyone's got to think like a designer.
And just for like a tactical takeaway, if you can't afford a fashion show or a presentation, a lot of the ways that I discovered cool designers are through just this piece that is street style. And I think that's something that a lot of these emerging designers should take advantage of. And whether you're gifting or allowing influencers or key bloggers, aligning with the right one and allowing them to wear your clothes. I mean, that's how I discover most of these emerging designers. And they should take advantage of that, yeah.
So is that when you're working with a photographer, you're at the shows, you're asking people what they're wearing, or are you going up to somebody as a consumer, as Aria, not as Aria WGSN, and saying, what are you wearing? I love your top.
Well, no,
I need to know.
typically, so the designer will say, hey, influencer, can you wear my coat to Fashion Week? And the influencer will, and usually they're photographed, and then on their social media platforms, they'll say, I'm wearing X designer. So it's, promotion for that designer. So that's typically how I'm able to figure out.
Doesn't the influencer normally go, yeah, where's the money?
Yeah, that might be, but I think,
always.
yeah, but if you have great product that they really believe in, they'll be happy to wear it.
And what do you think of that, Simon? I'm intrigued.
There's nothing new to that. I mean, payola was before I was even born. Like pay to play. I think that's good. That's part of the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's another one that I'm honestly perplexed, but why people don't use it. And it's this new thing called social media. And but if you look at my Twitter feed, right, I follow all these different people, and what they do is they tell me if they had donuts for breakfast, which is 0% fascinating, or they tell me I can go here for this great new offer, or they'll tell me the other thing that everyone else has already said, which was all garbage. And the point I'm making is that social media is really hard. Just like being a designer is really hard, and it should be hard. But if you're good at it, and if you put the effort in, and if you think like a designer in terms of your social media, if you actually look at what you're doing, I don't mean be like a social media consultant and like rent yourself out. I mean, like with being a designer or anything else, have an actual vision and think hard about what that is, and then do the homework and create those 10 tweets a day or whatever it is to make yourself successful at it. And then people will know who you are. Because, getting retweeted is actually quite good. And I find new people to follow on Twitter if they get retweeted by people I like. And guess what? I don't retweet special offers. So, like, it's right there and it's free. That's what I love. It's free. And people just aren't making the most use of it.
So actually, that goes back to our original point, is when you're creating the brand, when you're creating your designs, in fact, your strategy obviously needs to be in place from the very conception of your idea. And perhaps, a 10 commandments.
Well, it's this design thinking manifesto. We actually created it at Parsons a few years ago. We called it the Fashion Manifesto. And it's evolved into I have OCD, right? The obsessive compulsion to design. Wherever I am, I'm walking around looking, I wouldn't do that, what's that? I told you I had a row this morning with a bloody coffee shop because they didn't know how to make a cappuccino. I'm like, fine, it's a coffee drink, all right? But it's not a cappuccino, so don't call it that. That's not. So,
Yeah, directs everything.
It's true. It drives me crazy. And so, but there are rules, I think. Be nice. I don't know I've ever met a designer who succeeded by being horrible. I get to work with lots of interesting people, and I don't ever work with horrible people because I don't have to. Mm-hmm. So I encourage our students to be nice. You are your own brand. Every single thing about you, whether it's your shoes. I mean, here we are in this lovely studio, in this lovely building, with all this furniture and all that. We're all dressed in a certain way because we've thought hard about every single thing. There's nothing happening here by accident. So that's because we get it to a degree. But I bet, we can all go through our own lives and say, actually, that thing I just did over there wasn't very cool. I probably shouldn't have done that. Didn't enhance my brand. So you are your own brand. Every single thing about you. And I love when students are like sitting in the audience and they're like that. And they put their hand on, like, yeah, I've got a question. Like, oh, yeah, I'm going to remember you. Anyway, sorry.
No, I think it's a really interesting point. But isn't that perhaps a little sad that we have to be so self-conscious of our brand at all times?
Well, yes, I suppose you could look at it that way. I feel like if you're not, you won't be successful. And that's quite good because that's as it ever was. Successful companies were successful for a reason because they were really good. And perhaps by accident, they told good stories and they had good people around them and, all things came together.
Stories.
See, that's the thing. Not brands, not designers, stories. And I was hoping we were going to come to that because the social media side and everything else, it's about the story. It used to be that we wanted to buy a thing by a designer. I want that Gautier jacket. That's all I want. If I don't get it, I'll die. And then later on, it became, I want something by Gautier. It could be the fragrance or the whatever it is.
And is that when the designer became the brand?
Exactly. And then now it's stories. Now I want to know all about that person. I want that person to be in my life via social media or whatever else. And then I'll start to feel like I'm part of them. And then I'll want this thing. This. It's much more. It prevails every part. It prevails every part of who we are and where we are. Like Apple, of course, is the is just the masters at that. I mean, hands up anyone anywhere, frankly, who's ever going to watch this who hasn't got an Apple product. It's just ridiculous. I mean, they would just be lying. You'd have to have invented your whole life.
And so, in fact, what we're saying is that with social media being so prevalent, or multimedia being so... Omnimedia being so prevalent. Being so prevalent in people's lives. In fact, you can access a brand or a designer in so many different ways, and which is perhaps how behind the scenes was the first kind of way of seeing the real brand when everybody was they were making the commercial for perhaps Armani jeans, but they were also doing behind the scenes videos, and those were released on their channels, be it YouTube or via their Twitter. I think that's elevated now, that's progressed, but you're right, it's this all-seeing eye. You want to understand the DNA of that, and because there are so many more ways to do that, you have to be tapping every one of them. I mean, I'm really intrigued to know as well, do you have any top tips for marketing? What are the new ways of addressing marketing? What are the new ways of thinking about getting your brand out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think one important thing to think about, which is not new, is consistency in your vision is extremely important.
Yeah.
You need to understand the DNA of your brand, what you want to stand for. And if you really truly understand that, then the rest is kind of easy, because the way you execute every part of your marketing strategy, easy is maybe not the right word, but it comes naturally. The way you execute every part of your marketing strategy has to tie into that. Now,
and consistency within that message.
Consistency within that message. People react when they keep hearing the same thing again and again. It takes a while for that to absorb. So yes, you have to embrace the new channels, and those channels include both the social media, they include dressing influencers, they include being on websites, they include, in some cases, doing shows. But in the end, it's the core of the message that you're putting forward, and that's not new.
Mm. Yeah. And actually being selective in your approach of where you're going to place those messages.
Absolutely.
I like to base all of my messages on either pop songs or old adverts. So, because I agree fervently, but I think it makes it really easy to remember. So I gave a speech in China last week, and the title was "Oops, I Did It Again."
Was there a dance routine to go with that speech?
I mean, I did it then, but we haven't got time now.
Oh, we can make time.
But the consistency, Aslaug, is exactly right. You know, you see these wonderful statements or sites or collections or shows, but then if the next season is not better, you've blown it. It's all over, because the public's memory is about that long. And the other one is Just Say No, which was that wonderful 1980s anti-drug campaign in England. But you've got to say no. You've got to turn down things, because you know what. And I feel your point about Aria, your point about it's not right to have a show sometimes. I interviewed some designers that graduated from Parsons, Vina Carver, and they started very small and they grew and grew and grew. And we talked about what would you have done if someone came to you on day one and said, "Here's a runway show in Lincoln Center." It would have been terrible. Because they would have shown, and they would have been sort of punching above their weight without any of the backup to sustain it. So then they could have got an order for X, whatever it would be, from one of the big stores, and there's no way they could have filled it. And then if they could have filled it, they couldn't have waited to get paid for it. So, they just weren't ready for it. So saying no, both to anything that's outside of your core brand message, but also to opportunities that don't enhance your strategy, is really important. It's very difficult. I don't underestimate the importance of that, because you need the cash. But you can't do it. You've got to stay true to that core vision.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question, because I know this is something young designers, and I know as millennials, a lot of the times we like to go out on our own. What do you think, what do you think of, should designers work for another fashion house before starting their own? What does Parsons tell students? I guess everyone's journey is different, but...
Yeah. We two things, actually. I used to have one answer to that. Now I've got two. The first one is, get a job with someone else, for goodness sake. Don't be crazy. Just go and spend someone else's money making all the mistakes you can. Learn from all of that. Get all the knowledge you can. Because when you leave Parsons, you're starting your education. All we've done is give you some of the tools and some of the questions. So the first answer is absolutely do that. The second one is, yes, definitely work for somebody else. There was a great piece by Vanessa Friedman in the Times last week about Alex Wang. And, she was questioning, can you do Alex Wang and Balenciaga? And the answer is, of course you can, in my opinion, of course. Why? You're a designer. I can design trousers, and I can design jackets, and I can design at the high end, and I can design the low end. It's about understanding what design is. And certainly you have a signature, you have a vision, and it wouldn't be appropriate for one designer to work for a brand over here if it's completely outside of their milieu. So
you're not diluting the message.
No, I actually, it struck me when I was chatting with Vanessa about the article that I felt patronized, not by her, I felt patronized by the question. What do I not have a point of view on the design of a table just because I'm a fashion designer? Of course I have. And, since there's been Yves Saint Laurent and other the great designers, there have been other things with their names on. It's just completely logical. Yeah. So, and I think for a designer to sustain their brand, they're bound at some point to have to work for somebody else. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. And Aria, going to the other end of that chain, I'm really intrigued. Obviously, your specialism is in retail, bricks and mortar retail. Can you tell us, how is the retail landscape changing to adapt to our kind of demand and desire for always the newest designer and the most exciting emerging designer?
Well, I think now more than ever, retailers are very interested in emerging designers because, just to put it frankly, people aren't going into stores. And the reason why they aren't going into stores is because there's not a lot of newness. And so, for instance, just this week, Lord & Taylor has launched this shop-in-shop called Brand Assembly. And it's full of like new and emerging advanced contemporary brands. And they'll be able to be there for, a limited amount of time, but if they have a strong sell-through, then Lord & Taylor will consider moving them to a more prominent position and having them on as a regular client in their roster. So that's one thing. Macy's has a incubator program. Bergdorf's wants to create like a lab for emerging designers. So I think now more than ever, particularly with department stores, they're very interested in building this relationship with new designers early and creating a discovery process through the shopping experience.
Well, everybody wants to be the one that discovered, right?
Right, exactly.
But I think that's a really interesting point as well about moving people's prominence within the retail space according to their sell-through. This is a merit-driven society, and therefore, if you're selling well for us, we'll push you forward. We'll give you a bigger space, and that, I think, is
Aren't
really
we rather saying McDonald's should have all the primary places on the high street? I mean, there is still the concept of the window dressing. When you produce a collection, you do your sort of runway pieces, which become the statement, editorial, etc., which no one's going to buy. Some maybe. Well, the point being, like, you look at some wonderful brands and they have these incredible collections, and yes, you're right, of course, people do buy them, but they sell a whole lot more of the other stuff, which keeps the lights on. But that's not the thing that gets people excited. Like, I may buy something from a designer because I truly admire the designer, I love the collection, but I still want the grey suit. But I feel good about that grey suit because it's from that designer and I have the association. Except for I don't, because I get all my suits made. Just for the record.
Oh my goodness. And we're actually, time-wise, I feel we have to kind of wrap this up fairly shortly. But something I wanted to ask you, which is like, let's talk about practical, actionable ideas. Can I have your top tips, please? It can be any part of this process, but if there are designers out there who want to know about, if I have 5 takeaways, what are they? Simon?
I've got like 300 or something. The first one is tell the truth. If it's a dress, then you have to be able to walk in it. And if you can't walk in it, but it's your vision, well, it's beautiful, but it's not a dress. So tell the truth. Like the Marcus Aurelius said, ask of each thing what it is in itself. So do that. For instance, this morning's drink wasn't a cappuccino. It was milk and coffee.
Just don't name that coffee shop on it.
Do your homework. Like, don't send a message to a buyer if you haven't got it right. Like, think about it. Like, just get the spelling right. And I say this because so many people don't. What's wrong with these idiots?
Absolutely.
Or write to someone and say, you should stop my collection, when they don't even do that kind of thing. Like, do your homework.
Yeah.
Be nice. I mentioned that one earlier. And just have this pure message. Like, stick to it. Don't compromise on it. Don't give in. The phrase that I use when I'm giving big speeches is never, 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 never give in, which is a horrible crib from Sir Winston Churchill. But I believe it genuinely. Like, just don't do it. The number of times I drive my staff crazy because something comes in, an invite or something, and we look at it and we go, we've only got a day. It's not quite what we wanted, but, we need to get something out. And they'll look at me like, we're better than this. And that's it. It doesn't matter. There's no conversation. We just chuck it in the bin and we do a proper one because that's who we are. We don't compromise. And so, I think if you just do those very simple things, then it will change the nature of who you are.
Just a couple of additional points. I think one is understand your strengths. So, we've talked about, the need to be able to navigate the marketing side. But if you as a designer, if that isn't your forte, you can bring people in to work with you that support that function and understand what you're good at, understand whether you're good at the business and marketing side. If you're not, you're going to need help to find someone who is and bring it in.
Absolutely.
So I think that's key. The second would be stay focused. I think one of the big challenges for so many designers that are starting their brands is they want to do everything on day one. They want a lifestyle brand with all of these categories. And you can be aiming towards that in your 10-year plan or your 20-year plan, but you need to take one step at a time. So it doesn't mean, you have to be, have just one path and never go off of that, but you need to have a clear strategy. And if for some reason an amazing opportunity comes up that leads you in a slightly different direction, that is fine. You can assess, but you can't be trying to work all angles at the same time.
Mm. And Aria?
I was going to say, consider trade shows. I mean, Lord & Taylor's Brand Assembly is a new Los Angeles trade show that opened up, and I think a lot of people are focusing on the trade show experience. And sometimes it kind of is overwhelming, but organizers understand that, and so they're interested in highlighting really new designers, and this is where buyers are, and also press. This is where you can get a lot of promotion. So it's obviously, it sounds fabulous to be a part of Fashion Week, but consider trade shows, and there's a lot of new ones that are really trying to be more curated and refined and offer a better experience that your brand might fit really nicely into. And then I have advice for retailers. I think retailers, while I'm happy that Lord & Taylor and Bergdorf are doing these great things, I wish more retailers would think like Topshop with these collaboration collections and partner with emerging designers as opposed to the more established ones. I think, I just think that's important. And, a lot of the times they go for the bigger name that's more established, but I think the assortment would be a lot more interesting if they also collaborated with emerging designers.
And on the right of the screen, you'll see some of our top tips for designers to watch. I just wanted to say, as a final point, Aria, can you just give us, we're on day 7, who do you love?
So I saw Sandy Lang, who's actually a Parsons grad, and her presentation was great. She does really playful things with fur, and I loved her presentation. I also like Nomiya, who I don't think they're showing, but they are part of the CFDA incubators. I love what she's doing. And my third one is escaping me, but refer to our blog where we have a few designers to watch. Oh, it was one of my favorite presentations at Milk on Saturday night. I think it's pronounced Kunor, but they're based in Milan, but they showed here. And there was a lot of really beautiful artisanal details, great pattern. It was different, but very commercial.
Fantastic. So on that note, we're going to put those out on our channels. Get Googling. We hope you have found some actionable and interesting points from our wonderful panel here. Simon, Aria, Aslaug, thank you so much for speaking to us. We will be getting back to your questions, but for now, thank you so much. Thanks, guys.